We spend most of our lives assuming tomorrow will arrive. We plan. We speak about the future as if it were guaranteed. We move through the world as if the line between being here and not being here is distant. But on a dark highway, that line became real. Metal twisted, glass shattered, gravity lost direction, and for a few suspended seconds, a young man believed he was gone, not injured, not unconscious, gone. And in that belief, there was calm. That is the detail that lingers, not the crash, not the speed, not the danger, the calm. Because calm is not what we expect at the edge of death. We expect panic, we expect desperation, we expect the mind to fight. But what he described was different. A quiet internal shift, a release. Neuroscience offers explanations. Extreme stress can alter perception. The brain can detach from overwhelming experience. Adrenaline can distort time. Dissociation can soften emotion. All of that is real. But even if the mechanism is biological, the experience still matters. For a few seconds, he believed he no longer existed. And instead of chaos, there was stillness. We cannot say what that means. It may be nothing more than chemistry. It may be the brain protecting itself. Or it may reveal something subtle about how consciousness behaves when it confronts its own disappearance. What matters is not proving anything supernatural. What matters is noticing the pattern. Across different stories, different personalities, different circumstances, a recurring calm. Not universal, but present often enough to ask questions. And questions are where understanding begins. After that night, life continued. Success came. Hollywood came. But the memory of that quiet never fully vanished. Because once you have believed, even briefly, that you are no longer here, something shifts. Death is no longer abstract. It becomes intimate. And intimacy changes perception. So here is the only honest way to end this story. Not with certainty, not with conclusions, but with a question. If everything stopped tonight, what do you imagine would happen inside your mind? Would fear take over? Or would there be a moment, however brief, of stillness? A moment where resistance dissolves. A moment where identity loosens. We do not know. But stories like this remind us that the edge between being and not being may not look the way we expect. And sometimes, what stays with us is not the violence of impact, but the quiet inside it. Near-death experiences are often described as transformative. People speak of rebirth, of clarity, of spiritual awakening. That is not what happened here. There was no dramatic conversion, no sudden enlightenment, no public declaration about the afterlife. Life continued. But something shifted quietly. When you truly believe you are about to stop existing, even for a few seconds, the idea of permanence dissolves. He went on to build a career, to become known, to speak openly about addiction, vulnerability, risk. But that moment on a highway never fully disappeared. Because once the mind has rehearsed death, even briefly, it cannot completely return to innocence. There is a before, and there is an after. Before, death is abstract. After, it is intimate. He has spoken about risk differently since then. About how the thrill of recklessness loses some of its shine when you've already glimpsed the cost. Not in a moral way, in a visceral way. Because speed is no longer theoretical. Metal is no longer hypothetical. Mortality is no longer distant. And here is the subtle part. When you have felt calm at the edge, fear loses its absolute authority. That does not make someone fearless. It makes them aware. Aware that the body can break. Aware that control is fragile. Aware that the mind behaves in ways we don't expect when everything collapses. The accident did not turn him into a mystic, but it introduced a fracture in certainty. And fractures change how light enters a structure. You begin to question assumptions, not loudly, quietly. you begin to notice how thin the line is between being here and not, between narrative and silence. Some people avoid thinking about that line. Others cross it accidentally, and once crossed, it becomes impossible to ignore. The memory of calm remains, not as proof of anything supernatural, but as a reminder that the human mind is capable of unexpected stillness in moments we assume would be chaos. And that stillness lingers. There is a rational explanation for almost everything that happens inside the human brain. Extreme stress floods the body with adrenaline. The amygdala activates. Time perception distorts. The prefrontal cortex partially shuts down. This can create the sensation that everything is slowing down. It can create detachment. It can even create calm. Dissociation is not mystical. It is neurological. When trauma becomes overwhelming, the brain sometimes separates the self from the experience. It reduces emotional intensity. It numbs. It protects. From that perspective, nothing about this story is mysterious. A teenager crashes a car at high speed. His brain shifts into survival mode. He experiences time distortion, emotional dampening, post-traumatic derealization. Case closed. But that explanation, while correct, does not fully address one detail: the calm, not the absence of screaming, the presence of stillness. There's a difference. Many survivors report chaos in memory, blurred fragments, confusion. But he remembers clarity, a thought that arrived cleanly. This is it. No desperation, no frantic resistance, just awareness. Neuroscience can explain the mechanisms, but mechanisms are not meaning. We understand how adrenaline works. We understand how trauma alters perception. What we don't fully understand is why, in the face of annihilation, the mind sometimes chooses peace. Is it chemical? Evolutionary? A final neurological mercy? Or is consciousness capable of something more complex than a simple fear response? This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because if fear is not automatic at the edge of death, then what is? And if the mind can detach so completely from the body in crisis, what exactly is the relationship between the two? We are not suggesting an afterlife. We are not dismissing science, but we are acknowledging a pattern across different stories, different cultures, different personalities, a recurring calm at the edge. And that pattern is worth noticing. Surviving the crash should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Because what unsettled him didn't happen during the accident. It happened after. The body heals. Bruises fade. Metal can be replaced. But the mind does not reset so easily. In the hours that followed, something felt off. Not physically, internally. He has described a lingering sensation, a quiet doubt, a question that refused to disappear. What if I didn't make it? Not metaphorical, not poetic, literal. For several days, he genuinely questioned whether he had survived. Imagine that. Walking, talking, breathing, and still wondering, am I actually here? This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a dramatic exaggeration for a podcast. It was confusion, a subtle fracture in perception. Reality felt intact, but something underneath it felt unstable. The world looked the same, but it didn't feel anchored the same way, as if there had been a version of events where he did not survive. And somehow, he was in the wrong one. Now, neuroscience has explanations for this. After extreme trauma, the brain can dissociate. It can create a temporary separation between experience and identity. Shock can distort perception. Adrenaline can scramble memory. The mind protects itself by fragmenting. All of that is real. All of that is documented. But here is what makes this interesting. He did not describe fear. He described detachment, a strange neutrality. as if the boundary between existing and not existing had become thin. For days, he carried that thinness with him, looking at people, looking at rooms, looking at the world, and feeling slightly displaced inside it. Most people who survive accidents talk about gratitude, relief, second chances. He talked about uncertainty. That is different. That is psychologically unusual, because near death is one thing, but believing you might already be gone is something else entirely. Eventually, the feeling faded. Reality stabilized. The question stopped echoing. Life continued. Hollywood happened. Success happened. But that internal memory, that moment of calm and that lingering doubt never completely vanished. And that is where this story stops being about a car crash and starts becoming about consciousness. The first impact was violent, but it wasn't the first impact that mattered. It was the moment just before it. That fraction of a second when the brain understands this is no longer under control. The steering wheel turned, but not enough. The tires screamed, metal shifted, and gravity stopped making sense. The car lifted, not fully, just enough. Enough to know this was no longer a mistake. It was an event. And then it happened. The vehicle rolled, once, twice. The windshield fractured into 1,000 small stars. The world outside spun in impossible angles. Sky, road, sky, road. Inside that chaos, something unexpected unfolded. He has described it not as terror, not as panic, but as awareness. A very clear thought. This might be it. Not dramatic. Not shouted. Just present. The body braced for impact. But the mind did something else. It detached. Time stretched. Seconds felt longer than they should. Sound became distant, almost muted, as if the brain had lowered the volume of reality. And in that suspended moment, he felt calm. Not bravery, not heroism. Calm. He has said later that he genuinely believed he was dying, and what unsettled him wasn't the belief itself. It was the absence of fear. There was no screaming inside his head, no desperate bargaining, no final montage of memories. Just stillness, acceptance, a strange internal quiet as the car continued to flip. And when the movement finally stopped, when metal settled, when the world returned to a fixed position, he was still there, breathing, alive. But something had shifted, because for a brief window of time, he was certain he had crossed the line, and that certainty stayed with him, long after the crash ended, before the interviews, before the podcast studio, before the red carpets and late-night television. Dax Shepard was just a teenager in Michigan. No fame, no audience, no Hollywood. Just a young man with speed in his bloodstream and confidence that felt unbreakable. He has never hidden that part of himself. The recklessness, the impulsiveness, the appetite for intensity. For some people, risk feels like rebellion. For others, it feels like freedom. When you are young, the body feels indestructible. The future feels guaranteed. Death belongs to other people. That illusion can last for years, until one moment breaks it. He was driving fast that night. Too fast. Not as a calculated decision, not as a philosophical act. Just youth, adrenaline, momentum. The road was dark. The kind of darkness that absorbs headlights instead of reflecting them. There are seconds before an accident where the brain realizes something is wrong. A subtle misalignment. A correction that doesn't correct. The wheel responding half a second too late. And in that fraction of time, the body knows. Something is about to happen. He has described losing control, not gradually, suddenly. The car no longer responding the way it should. The physics of movement no longer predictable. Metal beginning to move in ways it was never designed to. And then the crash began. Not one impact, multiple. The vehicle flipping. The world outside the windshield no longer horizontal. Sky where the road should be, road where the sky should be. Inside that rotating metal shell, the human mind did something fascinating. It did not immediately scream. It did not collapse into hysteria. It shifted. That shift is what stayed with him, because what followed was not chaos in his mind. It was clarity, a strange internal stillness as everything external fractured. And that is where this story stops being just an accident and starts becoming something harder to explain. There are moments in life when everything feels permanent. The road ahead, the body you inhabit, the certainty that tomorrow exists. And then there are moments when that illusion fractures. A highway at night, dark asphalt reflecting distant headlights, music playing too loud, a teenage driver who believes nothing can touch him. Speed feels like control when you are young. Risk feels like proof that you are alive. But control is fragile. And on one particular night, control vanished. The wheel slipped. The car drifted. And what followed was not cinematic slow motion. It was violence, metal twisting, glass erupting, the world rotating in impossible directions. And inside that chaos, something unexpected happened. Silence. Not external silence, internal silence. Years later, a Hollywood actor would describe that moment in a way that unsettled listeners. Not because he claimed to see heaven, not because he described a tunnel of light, but because he said something far stranger. He thought he was dead, and he did not feel fear. Think about that. Most of us assume that death, or the belief that death has arrived, would trigger panic, screaming, desperation, regret. But what he remembers is calm, a shift, a surrender that did not feel dramatic, just quiet. This is not a story about the afterlife. It is not a story about religion. It is a story about what happens inside the human mind when it reaches the edge. Because what occurred in that car was not only an accident, it was a confrontation with mortality, with identity, with the fragile boundary between I exist and I might not. And what he felt in that boundary may tell us more about consciousness than we are comfortable admitting.